Hey everyone, Dikko here with another kickass walkthrough. This is episode 4 of a multi-part series covering texturing stylized characters. In this video we're going to try and create some non-destructive texturing techniques to help build out more detail into our character design here. But first we're going to start with some very simple concepts so I can communicate exactly what we're going to do overall with our model. Alright, I want to kick off this tutorial with a simple example of what we're going to do with our model. So let's set up the layout here. So I want to split this screen into 3 quadrants. Well, not quadrants, 3 areas. And I want to show you the UV editor. I want to bring up the shader editor. And I want to have these things visible at all times. So I want to show you what's going on here. Actually, make that the image editor. So default cube, we already have our UV layout there. So if we just pop over to paint, you can see that the layout is already in there in the default cube. We have our principled shader there, so we're going to actually bring in our textures as you would normally. And what we're going to do is try to create a sort of non-destructive method for texturing our cube here. So to do that, we're going to start with a new image. In this case, I'm going to call this mask. I'm just going to stick with the regular settings there. And I'm also going to make another image called color alpha. And I'm going to give that some alpha transparency as well, all the way down to 0. And I want to demonstrate what these 2 different kinds of textures are for. So, at the moment, we have our cube here. Nothing fancy, just a plain old cube here. And I want to mix 2 colors together. So I'm going to use a mix RGB node. And I'm going to give it 2 colors, 1 yellow and 1 blue. Just so you can see exactly what's going on. And of course, at the moment, you can't really tell the difference because it's set to 0.5. But if you move the factor in either direction, so 0 being yellow and 1 being blue, you can see the potential of using this factor input as a means to determine what color we're going to get out of our texture here. All right. And that's where the mask texture comes into play. So if I bring in a texture node, image texture, mask, and hook that in, you can see that because the mask texture is completely black, we're getting a value of 0 at the moment. And that value of 0 determines the presence of yellow. Now, if we go into our texture painting mode, and make sure that our texture is available in our texture slots. And we start painting in a white brush, so pure white. You'll start to see the blue come into play, and you can see in the texture map that working as well. So we're actually painting in white values with this. But here's where the real power of this method comes into play. So imagine if I wanted to give color 2 an actual texture. So maybe in this case, I'll give a checker texture. And give that some crazy colors. So maybe blue and red. Blue and pink, actually, let's do that. We can start to procedurally change the way the texture behaves without really having to repaint anything. So if we're going with like skin textures or, some normal maps, in this case, we can actually use this method with normal maps as well, with multiple normal maps being mixed together. Or if we wanted to have something being metallic and non-metallic, the same method applies here. But you can see that we have the ability to non-destructively edit our texture without relying on repainting objects or repainting things. We can rescale the attributes of a texture and all sort of stuff like that. Okay, now let's compare that with this other method using an alpha map. So again, I'm going to bring up another mix node. I'm going to disconnect that and bring that into here. I'm going to give this a color of, I don't know, blue again. So it's purely blue in the factor there. But this time we're going to use the alpha channel texture. And I want to show you what happens there. So image texture, let's call it color alpha. And in this case, this image here, the alpha channel texture, so this one without any, with full transparency at the moment, if I hook that into the factor, it will still determine it to be black or white, or black or, the texture to be black and white. But if I change it from color to alpha, and then I bring in this color node, we can start to actually texture into this image here. So let's get in and out so texture paint can recognize that input. Let's put that into the right node so you can see what's going to happen here. So now, at the moment, all we're seeing is the white, or in this case, we can make that blue. Now, if we paint on this texture, any color now, any color at all, you will see that we can effectively get a color texture with any color painted into that texture there. So again, you can see it's using the actual alpha channel to mix it this time, not black and white values. And this is really useful for sort of detail painting. So if you want to paint things like, something that's a bit more stylized, this is great. The only disadvantage with this here, though, is that this color texture here, this one with the alpha channel, it's destructive, basically. So what you're painting here is permanent. I mean, you can erase things. You can erase things with the, depending on what brush you're using. So in this case, I can change the brush to alpha erase. This is the other cool thing about the alpha channel brush, is that you can actually erase things because it has an alpha channel to erase to, which is really nice. But apart from that, you can't really edit the image that much, apart from smearing and erasing and replacing colors with new colors. But you can see the power there. But what if we combine both? We can actually combine now this mask channel and this mix channel into this mix input. So now we have a combination of everything together. So now I can still make my big decisions using these, these major changes. We can change these as needed. I can make that checker texture a different color, or any other texture really. I can scale that up and all that sort of stuff. And I can still edit this brush. I can still edit this mask. So going back into black and white texture painting mode, I can still bring up those broad stroke colors. But at the same time, if I go to my color alpha here, I can still make my detail colors. So I can make detail changes based on this input here. And this is the basic method that we're going to go ahead with for our character. So the nice thing about what we did in the previous video is that we've blocked out the big broad strokes, but we can still add a little bit of detail in terms of color tone, shadowing and all that sort of stuff into the skin texture, and then use the alpha channel version of our textures to bring in some extra detail. So lip color, eyeshadows, fingernails, all that sort of stuff can be done with the alpha channel there. And if you really wanted to, you can still do detail using this sort of mask mixing method. but you'd end up having a lot more mix nodes essentially. And you'll see as I build out my character that my mix node setup will get more and more complicated as I go through it. And technically it can be as complicated as I want it to be, but the nice thing is that it's non-destructive. And it's basically got that sort of substance painter style proceduralness to it that we want, which is really, really useful. And at the same time, I mean, like, you may be wondering about the texture node editor and how that works. And I may get into that with the next video, but the point is, by going with this method here, it kind of makes the texture editor a little bit more redundant than it needs to be. Because unlike the unfortunate thing about the texture node editor is that you're creating texture brushes basically. But if you were to edit that texture brush in the texture edit node, it doesn't edit the strokes that are already existing on your model. So it's still a destructive method of painting. Whereas with this, you're getting a lot more flexibility to change things out. And again, you can always change out the texture at any given time with the first method. So I can bring in, like, say, a noise or something like that. So let's bring in a noise map. Let's see, noise texture. And I can easily swap that out. And you'll see it's bringing that up. I can change the scale, detail, all that sort of stuff. And you can still edit those textures as well. So if I wanted to, I can make it, put in a ramp. And I can, bring down that detail. And you can see the potential here for really cool stuff. So, you can change the colors to whatever you like. That's really, really useful. So if I switch out to the mask again in the texture slot, I can bring that, play with those materials even more. I can still change the colors. So you're getting a much more flexible, much more usable texturing method. And before we wrap up, just remember that when we do start texturing this guy up, our model, remember to save your textures. So remember to save them when you are finished texturing with them, or remember to save them as soon as you generate the texture maps for texturing, because then you can save things quickly, and Blender will remember to remind you to save your files when you exit the program. So always remember to save the image, because otherwise it will disappear. So with that in mind, let's jump into our model and play with this method with our own characters. Bear in mind, I'll be also using this method for other features as well, especially with the normal map, and we'll get into that when we start talking about that soon. All right, let's jump in. All right, so we're going to start with exactly what we did earlier. So at the moment, I have my baked textures from the last video connected to my character. So I've got a normal map and my basic diffuse. And now it's time to start working through creating some masks that we can use for mixing more texture detail. So I'm going to start with a general mask texture. And of course, this is going to be a tiled texture because I'm working with UV tiles, so it has to be tiled. And once I save those images, you'll understand. And I'm going to make those file sizes 2048 by 2048 to match the resolution of my other textures as well. And as soon as I finish creating that file there with the textures, I am going to save that to my computer. So I know that whenever I'm going to save an image, it will be saved to my desktop, or if I close Blender, it will remind me to save the image. And of course, I'm setting up my UDIM tiles, my UV tiles versions as well. And then I save the image. And I'm just going to give you a heads up. I will be speeding up the video as I get more and more into the video, because I took around 4 or 5 hours to texture up this character. So, obviously I can't show you the whole process in one chunk. I'm not that fast. No one is. So, that's why I show you the concept at the start, so you can take that idea and apply it to your own characters. So as I start to texture, don't get annoyed. It's just me saving some time to show you the method being used in practice rather than you being confused by the complexity right up in front of you. So again, I'm always encouraging you to experiment with the basic method, and you can adapt it, change it, and make it work for your character or your design. And of course, a few other things to be aware of. We need to find an HDRI to light our character as we texture it. So my go-to place is always HDRI Haven. Easy to access, Creative Commons, open source texture maps for your own personal use. And it's just an amazing library. So download your HDRIs from there, connect it up to your world lighting setup, and then you're good to go. And in this case, I'm just going with a very simple studio lighting setup, nice and even. The light isn't too warm or too blue, so we can also work with a nice even lighting as well. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to knock out here is the beard. And the beard is interesting because not only am I going to use a mask to choose where the 5 o'clock shadow is, I'm also going to use a mask to determine where the pores and the hair follicles are. So you'll see me create another texture node here with a mask for the beard that I've created earlier. So it's just a bunch of lines that represent the hair follicles. Note as well that I've also got a normal map there, which will be really useful to make it feel like I got that roughness in the beard as well. So I start off by determining the scale of my hair follicles by making sure I have node wrangler enabled, and then I add a mapping node to scale down or scale up the texture appropriately. So in my case, I have to scale up the texture so I can get the right amount of density of hair follicles around the face. So once I'm happy with that, I can start to build out the colors that I want, and I want to get that normal map up and running, so I connect that up as well. Just to see if the normal map's working, and it looks like it's working pretty good. And now it's time to add the mask. In this case, I'm masking out the colors of the beard from the hair follicles. So I just want that 5 o'clock shadow in the general colors there. So I'm going to bring in brown, and I'm going to change the second color to the hair color, so black. And it doesn't look like much, it just looks like a big pockmarked man at the moment, but you'll see how it comes together shortly. So that's the normal map of my body there. And that's the color map of the body from the previous video. So I'm going to use a mix node now to mix the normals before inputting it into the normal map. So now we have both the detail from our texture bake from the previous video and the normal map from the beard itself. And if we switch the mix node to say overlay or add, we can get even more detail mixing between the two. So in this case, I think I choose overlay in the end. And I do the same for the color. So now we're getting a sort of 50% on each side. So notice how the factor now can now be linked up with our mask texture that we're going to paint in for the beard. And here I am switching the normals to overlay in the mix. I'm quite happy with that result. So now it's time to use our texture map, our mask map, to determine where the beard is showing and where it is not showing. So we're going to input that in the appropriate slots where the factor is on both mix nodes, which are the ones used for both the color and the normal map. And of course, as stated before, because all the texture nodes are black, we're only seeing the bearded normal map popping up at the moment. And of course, if I were to swap the inputs on that normal, you'll see that the normal map for the face is coming up. So let's start texture painting in a mask. So make sure you have the mask selected in your texture slots. And ignore the icons for the brush strokes, by the way, on the side panel there. It's because I uninstalled a plugin and the pictures are still there for some reason. So you'll see me encounter a mistake here. I'm painting the texture, but nothing's happening. And it's because I forgot to change my UV map back to 1001 after baking the texture maps from the previous video. So make sure you have it set to your default UV map. And there you have it. Just like we saw in the concept example from the start of the video, I'm painting in the white values on my mask map. And now the beard is starting to show itself as a non-destructive texture. So I can still scale up the hairs on that beard. I can change the colors of the beard, all that sort of stuff. And I'll still be able to play with all those features, because eventually we'll be able to bake all that detail in a final bake after we finish texturing. And you can tell that the beard is way too dark here, way too brown and way too saturated. But because we're working with a non-destructive workflow, I can easily change the color as I need to, change the opacity, do all sort of good stuff and not have to worry about it. So just like in Substance Painter, the same principles apply. But in this case, we're working with a node-based setup and not a layer-based setup. And depending on how complicated your character is, what kind of detail you want to add to your character, you can add many more versions of this mix setup with different materials, different textures, different procedural textures, all that sort of stuff. As long as you understand how the mix setup works with the mix RGB or mix shader node, you should be good to go. And the nice thing about the mix RGB node is that you have the option to change your overlays or your mix factor to overlay, add, subtract, multiply, etc. and get different effects with either your normal maps or your color maps. And eventually you'll see me change the way that the color operates on the beard from the black and the brown. And at the moment, I feel like the transition is way too stark as well. So I'll actually add a ramp in between my mask and my mix factor, so I can ramp down or crunch down the white values to a gray, and that will represent a sort of transparency between the beard and the skin. And just like any other texturing method, you still have all the ability of the brushes, so you can still, you know, blur and smear and all that sort of stuff. It all behaves in the same manner. The only thing you don't get in Blender that you would get in, say, Substance is those sort of procedural or non-destructive features like blurring, whereas in Blender, you kind of have to do it manually. There's no real way of just having a blur node in your node shader setup to help make that possible. But I will say, yes, there are ways of doing it in a sort of workaround fashion. If you check out CG Cookie's blurring texture with cycle shader nodes video, you'll be able to figure out how that works. But again, it's just a workaround. It's not really an official Gaussian blur, for instance, that you would get out of, say, Substance Painter. And you can see here now, I'm trying to figure out how to make the hair follicles appear a bit darker over the beard itself. And you can see I ramped down the beard with a ramp node, so I can soften up those colors on the beard with the 5 o'clock shadow. But just like we would in anything else in 3D, I'm sort of going to try and figure out with a bit of problem solving how to get those hair follicles to be darker on top of the beard itself as well. And you can already see the node setup is starting to look a little bit jumbled, but that's just the way that node setups work. And you can organize those as well in different ways. You can group nodes together into their own little subnode, or you can even just frame them together. So eventually I will be organizing my node setup a little bit, so I know that this section of the node setup is all about the beard. So eventually I figure it out and realize that I've just put in the wrong mask node into my factor. So I have to actually put in the beard mask into my mix factor and then overlay that on top. So now you'll see me really push forward. Now that the beard's done, I'm painting in the head with the same beard mask, because I figured if he's shaving his head with the same razor of his face, he's going to have the same density of 5 o'clock shadow on both the head and the beard. So now I'm starting to do pretty much what I talked about at the start of the video. I'm starting to mix multiple mask nodes now. So now I'm just putting in some red undertones, some extra red undertones with another mask, and realize that as well, that every time you want to add another procedural mix or another non-destructive mix, that you're going to need another mask set of textures. So this is a new mask texture just for the red undertones. And I'm going to blur that with GIMP in this case, not with Blender. But once that's blurred in, I'm happy with that. So just blurring those up because I want it to be a very subtle transition from red or pinks to color. And then I'm just going to blur those out again because once you blur it in another thing like Photoshop or whatever, you need to sort of fix up the UV islands a little bit. So just a bit of smearing and smudging to even those out. And you can see me just smash out that. And now I'm starting to work in an alpha channel texture now, an alpha channel texture set. Because I'm going to start blocking in some extra shadows around the eyes, extra shadows around the mouth, all that sort of stuff. So using just an alpha channeled texture map now with a mix node. So just as we talked about at the start of the video. So I'm putting some shadowing into his wrinkles, working that into his, his pecs, and just getting in some extra sort of shading just to give it some more creepy, aggressive tones that work well with his face. So just sit back and relax when you watch this time lapse here, because not much is really going on apart from the actual painting process. So I don't really have any advice about technique here. It's pretty simple in Blender. You only have like 3 tools to play with, really. You have the brush tool, the blur tool, and the smudge tool, and maybe the pocket tool, but you're not really using that very often. But ultimately, there's not much to it. I mean, you can add like a texture brush to your brush setup, just like you could in Photoshop or whatever. But ultimately, you're just pushing and pulling colors around for the most part. So just a basic understanding of color tone is what really would help you here. So I'm just really blocking out color tone with soft brushes. I'm not using any texture brushes here because it's a stylized character. I don't really have to worry about that. So I'm just working in color tone really. And if I want to add some skin pores and all that sort of stuff, I'll probably just bring in an actual texture map that is tiled for that. I'm not really going to worry too much about manually drawing in that kind of detail. So when painting your characters, just think about the contours of the skin, the body, and the form, and see where you can accentuate and bring out some extra detail into those areas. So if you want a part that is a bit more accentuated and a bit more, obviously, contoured, that's where you start adding that texture detail. So in this case, I'm adding more contour around those sort of peaked areas, those sharp areas. I want to really bring that out because that's part of his design, and I really want to accentuate that. I put the shadows into his eyes, I put the shadow under his neck, and now I'm just testing to see how it looks with the hair. I might bring in some fake ambient occlusion. I'll paint that into his beard, around the base of the head, all that sort of stuff. And that will be really useful to help settle his mesh as well. So he's starting to look really good at the moment. And again, mixing another set of nodes. And now I'm just adding some detail. So, some eyeliner. I want him to have eyeliner. I'm actually going to put some nail polish on his nails as well, because I want him to be pretty, what's the word? Flamboyant. He's a buff, angry, flamboyant man. The great thing about having those baked in normal maps from our sculpt, it allows me to actually block in colors a lot faster as well, because I have that sort of outline to work with. And you might be wondering as well, why the hell do we bake in the normal maps and the color maps if we're just going to mix extra colors into our model here anyway? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's just performance. If you're going to try and texture with a multi-res modifier and try and texture with that detail in mind, your computer is going to crawl to a halt. It's so slow. So baking in all that high res detail into some texture maps for use on a lower res model means you can paint in a much more comfortable fashion without the lag. That being said, as long as you save your original node setup from the start of our video series here, you can always bring back the multi-res modifier and that blocking material and mix it with your texture setup to get the highest res possible out of your textures. And we might try that in our next video as well, because we're going to have to bake this stuff in as well before moving on to the clothing. And as you can see here, I forgot to save the texture map for the fingernails, and I ended up losing that information, so I have to repaint that shit in. Classic. And finally, we're just getting some last minute details in there. So the eyelids and the lips. And I'm just going to paint that stuff in with another alpha channeled map. So again, just really blocking that in. And some parts of the body are really hard to texture in the viewport. So it's better to just do it in the UV map editor or the image editor. And then sort of work your way out. So as you can see here, now that I've got that blocking in on both the lips, I can now sort of blur things out in the viewport. And of course, getting some few details in there as well. But we're coming toward the end of this video here, and I'm pretty happy with the final result. And you know, the nice thing about this setup is that if I wanted to change anything, like the skin color, the beard color, you know, the undertones, I can still do that pretty easily with these non-destructive texture methods. And work my way through that again. But otherwise, I'm going to start to work on the body and the hair. And you know, if I want to come back and add some skin pores and stuff like that to this body, I can do that. You know, freckles, all that sort of stuff. And we can do that with a bit of a polish pass before we bake in all this detail in the next video. And you can see here, I'm starting to paint in as well a roughness map to get the gloss into this thing. And you can see it's inputted just a black and white image into the roughness map of our PBR texture there. And of course, I'm always experimenting, so I'm always happy to try out new things. So don't be afraid to try out different nodes, different setups, and just work your way through the process. And here's the final result so far. I'm pretty happy with the result. I hope you like it too. And I hope that the information I've given you in this video has been useful. So now it's your turn to try this stuff out. It's going to be a bit difficult at first, but I believe you can pull it off. And with a little patience, experimental mindset, and a solid visual direction you have in mind, I'm absolutely certain you'll be able to smash out some fucking awesome textures. So good luck, catches, and have fun.